A wealthy man left his young son with an impoverished family, telling his wife that the boy had gone missing. 20 years later, the wife is shocked to meet her husband's employee because The city buzzed with life, its streets filled with the hustle and bustle of millions going about their daily routines. But Christopher Lindsay stood at his office window, gazing blankly at the New York City skyline. The towering skyscrapers, once symbols of his success, now seemed to mock him. What had been the crowning achievement of his relentless ambition was crumbling before his eyes. A bankruptcy notice sat on his desk, the words echoing in his mind like the toll of a final bell. The Lindsay Corporation, once untouchable, was falling apart. His hands tightened into fists. How did it come to this? He had given up everything, his morals, his friends, even his family, to reach the top. Now it was all slipping through his fingers. At home, his wife Catherine had just given birth to their son, a fragile child who entered a world on the verge of collapse. Christopher couldn't bring himself to look at him. The baby's cries echoed through the halls of their mansion, a painful reminder of the burden Christopher felt he couldn't bear, not with everything crumbling around him. As the days passed and his financial troubles deepened, a sinister idea began to take shape in his mind. He could make it all disappear. The failures, the losses, and the crying child who needed more than he could give. Desperation hardened his heart. The baby had to go. One stormy night, under the guise of taking the boy for a drive to calm him, Christopher wrapped the baby in a blanket and left behind the glittering lights of Manhattan. He drove to a rundown part of Brooklyn, far from the life of luxury the child should have known. He parked in front of a dilapidated house with peeling paint and dim windows. Inside lived a struggling family, desperate for any sliver of hope. Christopher knocked, cradling the baby as if he were holding a ticking time bomb. When the door opened, a tired but gentle mother stood there, alongside her husband, who looked worn from the weight of their hardship. They stared at the businessman standing in the rain, offering them a child like an unwanted gift. "Because that boy needs a home," Christopher said, his voice quiet but firm, his eyes hard with determination. "Take him in. Raise him like he's yours. I'll give you enough to get by, but you'll never speak of where he came from." The woman hesitated, her husband's pleading eyes finally convincing her to agree. With shaky hands, she accepted the baby, clutching him tightly, as though she could already feel the weight of his troubled future. Christopher turned and walked away, without so much as a glance back. His heart, already hardened, seemed to freeze entirely at that moment. At home, he faced Catherine, whose eyes were wide with fear. "Where's our son?" she asked, her voice rising with panic. "He's gone," Christopher said coldly, his face an emotionless mask. "He was taken. Kidnapped." Catherine's legs gave out, and she collapsed into his arms, a cry of anguish tearing from her throat. For a fleeting moment, Christopher felt something. Maybe guilt, maybe regret. But it vanished as quickly as it had come. His survival was all that mattered now. Years passed, and Catherine never stopped searching. Every missing child report, every faint lead reignited her hope, only for it to be crushed again and again. The grief consumed her, turning her into a mere shell of the vibrant woman she had once been. Christopher watched her with a cold detachment, knowing that her pain, though overwhelming, kept her tethered to him. Their shared nightmare of their son's supposed abduction was the chain that bound her. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, the boy, now named Ethan by the family that took him in, grew up without the wealth and privilege he had been born into. His life was one of constant struggle, with each day a fight against hunger and hardship. But Ethan was tough, a survivor. Even as a child, he had a sense that something wasn't quite right in his life, but he kept quiet about it. for now. While Christopher rebuilt his fortune, burying the past, the boy he had cast aside was fighting for his place in a world that had given him nothing. But destiny, ruthless and unyielding, was already at work, setting the stage for their inevitable reunion. When their worlds collided again, the truth would shatter everything. Brooklyn was relentless, its streets filled with blaring car horns, neighbors yelling, and the distant wail of sirens echoing through the narrow alleys. Ethan, now in his teenage years, had grown accustomed to facing life's challenges with steely resolve. The small, cramped apartment he shared with his adoptive parents was filled with worn-out, second-hand furniture, and the lingering smell of fried food seemed to always be in the air. Despite the financial struggles, their home was filled with love, a love that had carried Ethan through some of his darkest moments. But even with that love, Ethan often felt like he didn't quite belong. From a young age, a quiet sense of unease sat deep within him, as if he didn't fully fit into the life he was living. His adoptive parents had never treated him differently, yet there were still questions in his mind. Why didn't he look like them? Why did he feel such a deep emptiness where answers about his past should be? His adoptive mother had once mentioned his birth parents in passing, saying they had died, but then quickly changed the topic. That was the only information Ethan ever got. At school, the differences between him and his classmates became more obvious. Most of them came from the same kind of struggling backgrounds and seemed to accept their situation. But not Ethan. He was determined to break free from the poverty that followed him like a shadow. He stayed up late studying because of an unexplainable desire for something greater than his present situation, something that could take him away from the congested streets of Brooklyn. He excelled in school, his intelligence shining through despite the obstacles. Teachers took notice, and counselors gave him encouragement. Still, none of this filled the emptiness inside him. He felt like a boy without roots, drifting through a life that, no matter how hard he worked, never quite felt like his own. The unanswered questions about his origins weighed heavily on him. Why did he always feel out of place? Despite his academic success, Ethan's life outside of school told a different story. He took on several jobs to help support his struggling adoptive family, working at a grocery store, delivering food, and cleaning offices late into the night. The pressure on his young shoulders was intense. While his classmates were hanging out after school or going to parties on the weekends, Ethan was mopping floors or stocking shelves, always thinking about how he could rise above his situation. But it wasn't just the physical exhaustion that wore him down. It was the constant feeling that no matter how hard he tried, something was holding him back, reminding him of where he came from. Ethan's friends often spoke about college and dreams of getting away, but for him, those aspirations felt like distant, unreachable goals. Even so, he couldn't bring himself to give up. One night, after another exhausting shift, Ethan walked home under the faint glow of the streetlights, his hands sore from hours of heavy lifting. As he passed by a small park where kids played during the day, he paused for a moment, lost in thought. It felt like he was constantly running, always chasing a future that seemed just out of reach. The fear of being stuck in the same place forever weighed heavily on him, but there was a stubborn determination within him that refused to fade. He knew he had to push himself harder, to fight more fiercely than anyone around him. There was something he needed to prove, though he wasn't sure if it was to his parents, the world, or maybe just himself. After years of relentless effort, Ethan finally earned a scholarship to a small university. It was a win, but not the grand victory he had once envisioned. The university wasn't prestigious, and the scholarship only covered his tuition. He would still have to work to cover his living expenses. But to Ethan, it was a way out, the first break in the walls that had surrounded him his entire life. As he packed up his few belongings to head off to school, his adoptive mother hugged him tightly. "We're so proud of you, Ethan," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've made us proud every day," Ethan smiled, though deep down that familiar emptiness stirred. He loved his adoptive family, but that lingering feeling of not truly belonging never fully disappeared. His adoptive father handed him an old, well-worn suitcase, patting him on the shoulder. "You've got a bright future ahead, son," his father said in a gruff but affectionate tone. But as Ethan looked at the weathered faces of the people who had raised him, his mind was filled with thoughts of the past he didn't know. And as he left for college, the weight of unanswered questions stayed with him, more persistent than ever. Life at the university wasn't any easier. Ethan frequently felt like an outsider, looking in because of the surrounding students from wealthier families. He worked 2 jobs just to afford food and rent, while his classmates went to parties and planned vacations. But fitting in wasn't what mattered to Ethan. Success was. He had come this far, and nothing, not even the endless obstacles in his way, was going to stop him. Yet every night, as he collapsed onto the thin mattress in his rented room, the exhaustion was a constant reminder of the uphill battle he still faced. Ethan's thoughts often drifted back to where it all began. The unclear and shadowy tale of his birth lingered in his mind. The deep urge to uncover the truth of his past turned into an obsession. He needed answers. Where did he come from? Why had he been left behind? And why hadn't his biological parents fought for him? Somewhere out there, the truth existed, and Ethan was determined to find it. Manhattan's busy streets felt worlds apart from the worn-down sidewalks of Brooklyn, where Ethan grew up. As he stepped off the subway, the towering buildings seemed to loom over him, like silent watchers observing his every move. But today, Ethan was no longer the boy who once wandered those broken streets. Now, he was a man on the move. After countless nights of hard work and studying, Ethan had landed an internship at a respectable financial firm. It was his first real chance to break into the world of high finance, a world that once felt unreachable. Most of his fellow interns came from top-tier universities and had powerful connections, but Ethan had clawed his way forward, fighting for every opportunity. He knew he wasn't fully accepted in their world yet, but he was determined to make space for himself, even if it meant working twice as hard. The first day at the firm was a whirlwind of new faces, projects, and back-to-back meetings. The office, filled with glass walls and sleek modern decor, buzzed with energy. Ethan moved through it unnoticed, taking in every detail, missing nothing. His mind quickly adapted to the fast pace and complexities of the financial world. Still, he knew intelligence wasn't enough. He had to prove that, despite his humble beginnings, he could compete with the best. The work was grueling. Long hours spent poring over spreadsheets, writing reports and crunching numbers well into the night became his norm. But it was in those quiet, late hours, when the office emptied and the soft glow of the computer screens was all that remained, that Ethan thrived. He wasn't just chasing a paycheck. Ethan was focused on shaping his future. Over time, his hard work began to show results. His sharp attention to detail and unwavering persistence didn't go unnoticed by his managers. Soon enough, they started trusting him with more important responsibilities. While other interns complained about the long hours, Ethan saw it as a chance to grow. Each late night and weekend he sacrificed pushed him closer to his goals. Yet, even with his rising success, there was constant emptiness within him. No matter how much he achieved, questions about his past still hovered in the background, always there, lurking like a shadow. He'd often find himself gazing out his office window, watching the busy streets below, thinking about the people he'd left behind, his biological parents who had abandoned him, the life he could have had, but never did. When his adoptive mother fell ill, Ethan rushed back to Brooklyn, the city of his childhood. The once cozy apartment that had always been filled with love now felt small and fragile. His adoptive mother lay in bed, her skin pale, but her eyes warm when she saw him. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice weak but full of love. "You've done so well for yourself. We're so proud of you." Ethan took her hand, the familiar comfort of her touch grounding him in the moment. "I couldn't have made it without you and Dad," he replied, his voice heavy with emotion. She smiled gently, but her eyes became distant. "There's something I've wanted to tell you about your past." Ethan's heart raced. For years, he had buried the questions, focusing on his ambitions instead. But now, here was the truth he had always longed for, yet was afraid to hear. "I don't know much," she continued, her voice shaky. "We weren't told a lot. You were just a baby when we got you. The man who brought you to us didn't say much, but he looked troubled, like he was running from something." Ethan leaned in, his mind spinning. "Do you remember his name? Anything about him?" She weakly shook her head. "No, just that he seemed wealthy, but desperate." Those words stuck with Ethan long after she had fallen asleep. Wealthy, but desperate. Who was this man who had left him behind, yet made sure he was cared for? Not long after that conversation, his adoptive mother passed away, taking with her the few secrets she had known. Ethan found himself clinging to the remnants of a past that seemed to be slipping away piece by piece. The emptiness inside him grew larger, constantly reminding him that his journey was far from over. He craved not just closure, but understanding, answers that would help him uncover who he truly was. Back in New York, Ethan's career was on the rise. His sharp intellect and relentless work ethic had earned him a promotion, and before long, he was handling major projects with the confidence of a seasoned leader. His name started to circulate among the powerful circles, and he was getting noticed. One of the people taking note was Christopher Lindsay. To Ethan, Christopher was just another executive, someone he aimed to impress like all the others. But for Christopher, Ethan was different. He saw in Ethan the same drive and brilliance he once had in his own younger years. He took Ethan under his wing, mentoring him and offering advice. Ethan, unaware of their true connection, eagerly embraced the guidance. This was everything Ethan had worked for: recognition, power, and a path to even greater success. Yet something about Christopher unsettled him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. There was an intensity in the older man's eyes, a flicker of something beyond professional interest. It was as if Christopher recognized something in Ethan that he couldn't yet define, and indeed he did. Christopher, unaware that the brilliant young man he was mentoring was the son he had abandoned long ago, found himself captivated by Ethan's ambition and hunger for success. But there was also an eerie sense of familiarity in the way Ethan carried himself, in his sharp eyes and relentless drive, that stirred something within Christopher. He brushed it off, believing it was simply admiration for a talented protege. As Ethan's career continued to soar, the lives of father and son were unknowingly converging. Neither of them was aware of the truth that bound them, but the day of revelation was drawing near. When that day came, it would shake both their lives to the core. Meanwhile, Catherine Lindsay sat in her mansion's dimly lit library, staring at the papers spread out before her on the mahogany desk. It had been 20 years since her son disappeared, 2 decades since that fateful night when Christopher had told her their baby had been taken. Her heart had never truly mended. Despite the passing years, the pain still felt as raw as ever. She had employed numerous private investigators, chased every lead, and followed every glimmer of hope, all with the belief that her son might still be out there somewhere. But time and again, she was met with disappointment, the trail always growing cold before she could get anywhere. Grief became her constant companion, like a dark cloud hanging over her life, snuffing out any bit of happiness that tried to sneak in. Her husband, Christopher, had changed after their son's disappearance. He threw himself deeper into his work, relentlessly focused on rebuilding his wealth with an intensity that sometimes unsettled her. Once, Elizabeth had admired his ambition, but now she saw it for what it was, a barrier, something he used to shield himself from the truth of their loss, from her, and from everything they once had together. Their marriage had become just a shadow of what it used to be, held together only by the memories of a time when they were whole. One evening, after receiving yet another dead-end report from an investigator, Catherine found herself mindlessly scrolling through news articles on her laptop, searching for anything to distract her from the growing void inside. That's when she stumbled across a profile of a young businessman making waves in Manhattan. His name was Ethan, and he had risen from humble beginnings to a powerful position at a mid-sized firm. The article highlighted his intelligence, drive, and incredible story of overcoming hardship. At first, the name didn't strike her as significant, but something about the details of Ethan's life grabbed her attention. The timing of his adoption, the neighborhood he had grown up in, the age he would be now. It all seemed to line up. Her heart raced as she read on, her fingers trembling over the trackpad. It couldn't be possible, could it? Ethan's adoptive parents had lived in Brooklyn. They had taken him in as a baby, around the same time her son had disappeared. As her mind whirled, trying to fit the pieces together, a mix of hope and fear stirred inside her. Could it really be him? Could this successful young man be her lost son? Catherine couldn't help herself. She started investigating quietly, gathering every bit of information she could find about Ethan. She scoured through interviews, combed old social media posts, and even discreetly ran background checks. The deeper she dug, the more convinced she became that Ethan was the son she had lost so many years ago. Her heart swelled with a confusing blend of hope and fear. If Ethan was indeed her son, what had happened to him all this time? How had he ended up with strangers, abandoned and left to grow up in hardship, while she had spent years searching for him in vain? Her suspicions grew stronger until she knew she had to see him in person. She'd recently heard Christopher mention a rising young executive at his company who had caught his eye, a man named Ethan. The coincidence seemed too great to ignore, but she needed to see for herself. One brisk morning, Catherine drove to Christopher's office building, her heart pounding with every mile. She parked across from the sleek skyscraper, her eyes glued to the main entrance. People hustled in and out of the revolving doors, but she only had eyes for one person. Then, there he was. A sharp-dressed young man stepped out of a polished black car, his expression confident but reserved. He moved with purpose, like someone who expected the world to bend to his will. But it wasn't his walk or his face that made Catherine's breath catch. It was something much more familiar, the object in his hand. Ethan held a small, weathered leather notebook, clearly worn from years of use. Catherine's eyes widened as she recognized it immediately. It was the notebook. The one that had belonged to her father was passed down through generations. She had given it to her son, the last keepsake of his family, just before he vanished. Her world seemed to shift beneath her feet. The cold wave of realization hit her like a storm. This young man, Ethan, was her son. There was no denying it. Her mind whirled between shock and the painful clarity of what this all meant. Christopher had deceived her. He had known where their son was the whole time. Ethan hadn't been kidnapped. He had been abandoned. Catherine felt her world collapse around her. For 2 decades, she had been searching for the man she never realized was within their grasp the whole time. All while, Christopher kept the truth hidden away. A wave of burning anger swept over her. Christopher had stolen her son from her. And to make it worse, he had let her drown in grief and guilt for all these years. Without another thought, Catherine jumped in her car and drove home, her mind consumed with fury, betrayal, and disbelief. The truth had never been more evident. She knew what had to be done. Face the man she once loved, the one who had taken everything from her. That night, she confronted Christopher in the vast living room of their home. The fire crackled in the fireplace, but the heat it gave off was cold compared to the icy rage that filled her. "Christopher," she started, her voice just above a whisper. "I know about Ethan." Christopher froze, a glass of scotch halfway to his mouth. His eyes darted to hers, panic flickering, before he regained his typical calm demeanor. "What are you talking about?" he replied, his tone steady, but his hand shook slightly as he set the glass down. "I know he's our son. I know you lied to me," Catherine said, her voice growing louder with every word. Her emotions finally erupted. "You made me believe he was kidnapped. You let me search for him all these years, all the while knowing where he was. You abandoned him." Christopher's face turned pale. His carefully constructed mask, upheld for so long, began to fracture. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Catherine stepped closer, her voice trembling with the weight of her anger. "How could you do this? To me, to him. You stole my son from me and let me believe he was gone forever. You ruined us." The silence that followed was suffocating. Christopher stared at her, his expression empty as the reality of his actions settled in. There was no explanation, no justification for what he had done. Finally, with a deep sigh, Christopher dropped his head. "I did it for us, for the business. We were falling apart. I thought it was the only option." Catherine's voice was steely, her gaze hard as she looked at him. "You only ever cared about yourself." She shook her head, her words cutting deep. "And now you've lost both of us." Without another glance, she turned and left the room, leaving Christopher alone in the dark. The truth was out, and nothing could change what had been revealed. Ethan paced back and forth in his small apartment, his mind racing. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of revelations and emotions, and now everything he thought he understood about his life was unraveling. He had met Catherine Lindsay, the woman who claimed to be his biological mother. The truth she shared had turned his world upside down. The night they met still haunted him like a bad dream. Catherine had reached out to him unexpectedly, asking to meet. She had seemed nervous, but composed. When they finally sat down in a quiet corner of a cafe, she struggled to find the right words. Her eyes reflected both hope and heartache. I know you're my son," she said, her voice shaking. "The son I lost 20 years ago." Ethan had sat there, stunned. His heart raced as she recounted the night her baby was taken from her, the lies she was fed, and her long search that had finally led to him. At first, he refused to accept it. The woman sitting across from him, a polished stranger from a life of wealth, couldn't possibly be tied to the hardships he had grown up with. But as she shared more of the story, how he had disappeared, the cold truth of what had happened, Ethan began to see the pieces fitting together. It wasn't some tragic accident that had separated him from his biological family. His father, Christopher Lindsay, the same man Ethan had been working for, the man he had admired from afar and whose approval he had sought for years, had deliberately left him behind. Now, pacing the floor of his apartment, the weight of that betrayal felt like it was crushing him. He had fought so hard to earn a place in a world that always seemed to be pushing him down. And yet, all along, it was Christopher, his own father, who had been the one creating those obstacles. The betrayal cut deep, a wound that refused to heal. Christopher Lindsay, the man he had looked up to as a mentor, had discarded him like he was nothing, just a pawn in his grand scheme. His own father had left him behind without a second glance, all to save his failing business empire. Ethan's anger surged, fierce and unrelenting. Everything he had endured, the poverty, the constant struggle to survive, it all came back to Christopher. His life could have been so different. He could have grown up surrounded by wealth, privilege and love. Instead, he was thrown into a life of hardship, forced to scrape by on his own. Catherine had apologized over and over, her eyes brimming with tears, but Ethan could barely hear her. The weight of the truth was crushing. His entire life had been built on lies. In the days after their meeting, Ethan withdrew, wrestling with the enormity of what he had discovered. He let Catherine's calls go unanswered, uncertain how to even begin responding to her. She wanted to reconnect, to rebuild the relationship they never had a chance to form. But Ethan wasn't ready. The anger inside him still burned too fiercely. How could he possibly forgive someone who had played a part in his abandonment, even if she hadn't known? And Christopher, the man who had shaped his future, the one who guided his career, how could Ethan ever look him in the eye again without feeling the sting of betrayal? He knew the only way to move forward was to confront Christopher, to demand answers, to force the truth from the man who had taken so much from him. But the thought of facing his mentor and his tormentor in one fell swoop filled him with dread. What could Christopher possibly say to justify what he had done? Still, Ethan knew he couldn't run from this forever. The questions gnawed at him, refusing to let him rest. Why had Christopher abandoned him? How could he live with himself all these years, knowing his own son was left behind, forgotten? Finally, unable to stand the silence any longer, Ethan made his choice. He would face Christopher. He would get the truth. That evening, he found himself standing outside the towering Lindsay Corporation building, gazing up at the steel and glass fortress that had once been everything he wanted. Now, it felt more like a prison, a cage Christopher had crafted to trap him in a web of lies. Taking a deep breath, Ethan pushed through the revolving doors, the chill of the lobby washing over him like a long-time adversary. He strode past the security desk, his jaw set with purpose, heading straight for the elevator. As it ascended to the top floor, where Christopher's office towered over the city, Ethan felt his pulse quicken. When the doors slid open, he stepped into the minimalist space, its sleek lines and cold decor reflecting the tension in the air. Christopher was oblivious to the altercation that was developing as he sat behind his desk with papers all around him. "Ethan," Christopher greeted with a casual smile, looking up as though nothing had shifted. "Wasn't expecting you. What brings you here?" Ethan's heart raced, a mixture of anger and confusion threatening to overwhelm him, but he steadied himself, his voice cutting through the air with icy precision. "We need to talk," he said, locking eyes with Christopher. "About who I really am." For a moment, Christopher's expression flickered, recognition, perhaps fear, but he quickly regained his calm demeanor. "I'm not sure what you're getting at," Christopher responded slowly, reclining in his chair. "You've always been upfront about what you wanted. Look how far you've come, Ethan." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "Don't play games," he growled. "I know the truth, Christopher. I know who you are, and I know who I am." The silence between them stretched on, the weight of it thick in the air. Christopher's gaze never left Ethan's, but finally, with a heavy sigh, he stood, and walked toward the large window, staring out at the city lights shimmering below. "I suppose it was inevitable that you'd find out," Christopher said, his voice laced with regret. Ethan's chest tightened painfully. This was the moment he had waited for, the moment Christopher would finally confess. "You threw me away," Ethan's voice trembled with fury. "You left me and lied to my mother. You made her think I was kidnapped. You let me grow up with nothing while you built all of this." Christopher turned to face him, his expression impossible to read. "I did what I had to," Christopher said coldly. "The company was on the brink of collapse. We were losing everything. I couldn't afford the distraction of a child." Ethan felt like he had been punched in the stomach. "You abandoned your own son because I was inconvenient. Is that it?" Christopher's eyes flashed with something that almost looked like pain, but he didn't deny it. "I made a choice, Ethan. It was a tough decision, but I believed it was necessary," Christopher said, his voice quieter now. "I had to secure the company's future and preserve our legacy." Ethan's anger exploded. "Our legacy? You have no right to call it that. You ruined everything. Do you have any idea what my life was like? What I had to endure while you lived comfortably, far away from it all?" "I thought you'd be better off without me," Christopher muttered, barely audible. "You were given to a family that could provide for you." "Provide for me?" Ethan's voice trembled with anger. "I grew up poor, fighting for every ounce of success. Do you really think I needed your money? I needed a father. I needed a family." Christopher's face hardened, his composure fading. "I can't change the past, Ethan. I can't undo what happened." "No, you can't," Ethan replied, his voice now a low growl. "And I don't want anything from you, not your money, not your influence. I got here without your help, despite everything you did to wreck my life." Christopher stood silently, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. There was nothing left to say. Without a second glance, Ethan turned and walked out, leaving Christopher standing alone in the shattered remains of the life he had built so carefully. The truth had been revealed, but for Ethan, it only confirmed one thing. He wanted nothing to do with the man who had abandoned him all those years ago. Ethan stormed out of the elevator, his mind racing with fury and betrayal. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. The confrontation with Christopher had finally answered the questions that had haunted him for years, but those answers brought no relief, only deeper pain. It felt like the ground had collapsed beneath him, leaving behind only a pit of resentment and bitterness. The image of Christopher, calm and composed as he confessed to abandoning his own son, kept playing in Ethan's head. Every word Christopher had spoken felt like a knife, cutting deeper into wounds that had never healed. Ethan had always known something was missing, but now, knowing the truth, the burden of that knowledge felt unbearable. He thought about all the years he had struggled, the nights spent hungry, and in the isolation of not knowing where he came from. Meanwhile, his father had lived in luxury, rebuilding his empire while Ethan fought to survive. The thought ignited a fire within Ethan. He couldn't just let it go, couldn't walk away like nothing happened. Spinning on his heels, his anger surged through him like a raging storm. He had to confront Christopher once more, but this time with all the fury he had kept bottled up. Ethan stormed back into Christopher's office, his voice slicing through the air with raw intensity. "This isn't finished, Christopher." Christopher, who had been gazing out over the city, turned slowly. His face showed a mix of weariness and something Ethan had never seen before. Regret. Ethan didn't even notice, because his rage had blinded him. "You can't just walk away from this," he growled, stepping closer, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "You don't get to explain away what you did to me. You don't get to pretend this was all just business. You wrecked my life." Christopher stayed calm, though his eyes hinted at the storm inside him. "I know you're angry." "Angry?" Ethan's voice shot up, cutting him off. "I'm beyond angry. You left me behind. You made me live a life you couldn't even imagine, while you rebuilt everything, acting like I never existed. How do you sleep at night?" Christopher's jaw tightened. "You think this was easy? You think I wanted to do it? I didn't have a choice." "No choice?" Ethan's voice cracked with disbelief. "You had every choice. You decided to throw me away like I was nothing. You lied to your wife. Let her believe her son was gone when you were the one who ripped me from her life. I did it for us. For the company. To protect everything I built. Everything we could have had," Christopher said, his voice rising in frustration. "You don't get it, Ethan. You don't know what it takes to create something like this." "Create something?" Ethan laughed bitterly. "You didn't create a life. You destroyed one, mine." Christopher's face grew cold, his patience wearing thin. "I did what I thought had to be done. It was a different time, a desperate situation. And you think that makes it okay? You think that makes it right?" Ethan shook his head, his voice raw with emotion. "I grew up with nothing, Christopher. Nothing. While you sat in your office, I was making deals and growing your fortune. I was out there scraping by, wondering every day why I didn't belong, why I didn't know who I was." Ethan stepped closer. His voice is quieter now, but every word was laced with venom. "Do you know what it feels like to grow up not knowing where you come from? To feel like an outsider in your own life? Every single day, I wondered what was wrong with me, why my parents didn't want me. And now I find out that it wasn't just some cruel twist of fate. It was you. You chose this for me. You made me live that life." Christopher's face is usually so composed, twisted in a mix of frustration and guilt. He took a step toward Ethan. His voice was softer, almost pleading. "I was trying to save everything. The company, the future, our future. You have to understand there was so much at stake." Ethan's laugh was cold and bitter. "You keep saying our future, like that means something to me. But there is no us, Christopher. There never was. You made sure of that the moment you decided I wasn't worth it. And you want to talk about the company. About saving your empire. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask for your money or your power. I worked for everything I have, and I did it without you." Christopher's eyes darkened. His defense is rising. "You wouldn't be where you are today if it weren't for me." Ethan's temper flared again. "You really think that? You think I owe my success to you?" He shook his head in disbelief. "Everything I've achieved I've done despite you. Despite the fact that you left me in the gutter to fend for myself. I made my own way, Christopher. I built my life from nothing while you abandoned me." Christopher's face twitched as if he wanted to argue, but the weight of the truth was bearing down on him. He had nothing to say that could undo the damage. No words that could erase the years of suffering Ethan had endured. "I don't want your money. I don't want your legacy." Ethan said, his voice steady and resolute. "I want nothing from you. You had your chance to be a father, and you threw it away. The only reason I'm here is because I needed to hear you admit it. I needed to hear you say that you abandoned me, not because you were forced, but because you were thinking only of yourself." Christopher's face hardened, his eyes turning icy. "I did what I believed was right." Ethan slowly shook his head in disgust. "No. You did what was best for you. Now you have to live with the consequences." Christopher's stare wavered, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan thought he saw a crack in his father's cold demeanor. But it was too late for regrets. The damage was done, and no amount of time could fix the betrayal. Ethan turned towards the door, his chest heavy with emotion. "You're not my father, Christopher. You're just the man who tossed me aside. I owe you nothing. And from this point forward, we're strangers." Christopher took a step toward him, desperation creeping into his voice. "Ethan, wait." But Ethan didn't stop. He didn't even glance back as he pushed the door open and walked out of the office, leaving Christopher Lindsay alone, crushed under the weight of his own decisions. As Ethan stepped out into the crisp night air, the city lights flickering around him, he felt a swirl of anger, sadness, and an odd sense of relief. The confrontation had drained him, but it also freed him. He had faced the man who had abandoned him, the man who had influenced his life from the shadows. Now, he was free from that grip. But as Ethan walked away, he knew that the wounds from his past would never fully heal. The truth was finally in the open, but it came at a steep cost. He had lost any chance at a relationship with the man who gave him life. And though he had come to terms with it, the pain still lingered. There was only one person left who might help him find clarity: Catherine. Ethan's thoughts turned to her, the woman who unknowingly had suffered for years, searching for the son who had been taken from her. She had been lied to, just like him, and now she was the only person who could truly understand the depth of his pain. But even with her, forgiveness seemed out of reach. Could he ever truly forgive either of them? As the night closed in, Ethan realized the next part of his journey wasn't about finding answers. It was about whether he would ever find peace. Catherine Lindsay sat at her kitchen table, the evening sun casting long shadows throughout the room. The stillness in the large house felt overwhelming, with the quietness amplifying her heartache. Her meeting with Ethan had left her shaken to the core, stirring up a mix of relief and unbearable sorrow. She had finally found her son after 20 years, but their reunion wasn't the joyful moment she had once dreamed of. Instead, it was overshadowed by the dark truth of what Christopher had done. Her hands shook as she held a photo, one of Ethan as a baby nestled in her arms. His tiny fingers had wrapped around hers, his bright eyes full of innocence and trust. He had been the center of her world. But now, the lost years haunted her, like a shadow she could never outrun. Her heart ached for the connection they had missed. The years she had spent searching in vain, convinced her child had been taken from her. The man she had married, the one she had once trusted with everything, had stolen everything from her. Christopher's chilling confession replayed in her mind. "I did it for us, for the business." How could he? How could he deceive her, tear their family apart and discard their son like he was just a piece of the puzzle? Over the years, their shared suffering had weakened Catherine's love for Christopher. Now, it was completely shattered. The lies, the betrayal, the years of believing their child was gone. She couldn't bear it anymore. There was no forgiveness left. Taking a deep breath, Catherine made up her mind. It was time to leave the man who had broken her heart one last time. The following morning, Catherine found herself in her lawyer's office. She sat across from him, her hands folded neatly, but her voice was steady and clear. "I want a divorce," she said. The finality of her words felt both terrifying and liberating. "And I want half of everything." The lawyer raised his eyebrows, not surprised by her demand, but aware of the weight it carried. "Mrs. Lindsay, are you sure? This will be a very public and very challenging process, considering your husband's status." Catherine nodded firmly. "I'm sure. I won't let Christopher dictate my life anymore. I've already lost too much." The divorce process moved quickly, and as soon as the news broke, the media pounced, turning Christopher Lindsay's fall from grace into a public frenzy. Catherine couldn't care less about the gossip, the stares from the upper class, or the spectators eager to see how much of Christopher's wealth she'd walk away with. What mattered most to her was getting away from the man who had deceived her, the man who had taken her son and left her to face the pain alone. Throughout the negotiations, Christopher made attempts to reason with her and ask for forgiveness. But Catherine wasn't interested. She had no more words for him. Their marriage had been built on lies, and now it was collapsing under the weight of betrayal. She couldn't even look at him without feeling the sting of the years lost to deceit. The heartbreak of missing out on her son's life, all because of Christopher's selfish choices, still haunted her. But when she finally signed the divorce papers, Catherine felt a massive burden lifted. For the first time in what seemed like forever, she could breathe again. No longer was she trapped in a life under Christopher's thumb, tied to a man who had cut her so deeply. Yet even as she gained her freedom from the marriage, the wounds from her relationship with Ethan remained fresh, painful, and unresolved. She had tried to reach out to him, but Ethan kept his distance, grappling with the harsh truths of his past. Catherine could relate to his hurt. How could she not? But that didn't soften the sting of his rejection. She craved a connection with him, though she knew it would take time. And even then, forgiveness might never come. As days turned into weeks, Catherine poured her energy into rebuilding her life. She sold the mansion that had once been her gilded cage and moved into a smaller but elegant apartment in the city. It wasn't lavish, but it was hers, a space where she could start over, free from the shadows of her past. Still, no matter how hard she worked to move forward, thoughts of Ethan lingered. She had already lost him once, and she refused to lose him again. She had missed the first 20 years of his life, but she was determined to be part of whatever time they had left together. She needed him to understand that she had never stopped loving him, never stopped searching, and that the blame for their separation rested entirely on Christopher's shoulders. One night, Catherine finally mustered the strength to call Ethan. She had tried before, only to be met with either silence or brief, curt responses. But this time, something was different. Inside, she felt a quiet resolve, a determination to fix things, no matter how tough the path ahead might be. After a few rings, Ethan picked up, his voice cautious and weary. "Catherine." The way he addressed her, not as Mom, struck deep, but she fought through the hurt. "Ethan," she began, her voice gentle but firm. "I know I don't deserve anything from you. I know you've been hurt, and I can't even begin to understand the pain you've been carrying. But I want you to know that I never stopped looking for you. I never lost hope." On the other end, there was silence, an unspoken heaviness hanging in the air between them. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she continued, her voice trembling just a bit. "I just want to be part of your life, even if it's from a distance. You don't have to let me in, but I'll be here, waiting, whenever you're ready." Ethan's silence felt like it would never end, and Catherine feared she had lost him again. But finally, after what seemed like forever, he spoke, his tone quiet and uncertain. "It's hard, Catherine. Everything I thought I knew, it's all gone. I don't even know how to feel about you." Catherine's heart ached, but she understood. "I know. I won't push you. I just want you to know you don't have to go through this by yourself. I'm here whenever you're ready." The call ended soon after, but Catherine felt a small glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As she put down the phone, she gazed out the window of her new apartment, watching the city lights in the distance. She had lost so much, but for the first time in years, she felt a spark of something else. A chance to rebuild her relationship with Ethan, a chance to heal the wounds of the past. And that hope, however fragile, was enough to keep her going. Meanwhile, Ethan stood in his own apartment, still holding the phone, caught between anger and the faint stirrings of empathy. Catherine's words echoed in his mind, her sorrow, her regret, and her longing to make amends. It would take time, but maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he'd once thought. Christopher and Catherine Lindsay's divorce became the talk of the town, splashed across the front pages of the city's tabloids, tarnishing Christopher's once sterling image. The man who had carved out a powerful business empire through sheer determination now found himself on the verge of losing everything: his family, his fortune, and the legacy he had spent his life building. The divorce settlement stripped away a large chunk of his wealth, but the real blow came from the public spectacle it created. His investors and business partners began to lose faith in him. The foundation of the empire he had poured his soul into was beginning to crumble. Alone in his office, Christopher stared blankly at the empty whiskey glass on his desk, the distant noise of the city offering no solace. His mind kept circling back to his confrontation with Ethan, playing it over and over again. He had spent years justifying his past decisions, trying to convince himself he had made the right calls. But now, standing in the ruins of his life, the truth was glaringly clear. In his pursuit of power, he had given up the only things that truly mattered. Ethan's words haunted him, their sting fresh. The anger and betrayal in his son's voice were constant reminders of the devastation Christopher had caused. The young man who had once been his bright-eyed apprentice was, in fact, the son he had turned his back on. Now, Ethan wanted nothing to do with him. Christopher's thoughts drifted back to that fateful night 2 decades earlier. The storm had raged outside as he handed over his newborn son to strangers. At the time, he had convinced himself it was the only way to secure his future. But the truth, in hindsight, was painfully simple. He had been a coward. He had abandoned not just his son, but also his wife and his own humanity, all in the name of self-preservation. And now, he was facing the consequences of those choices. Across the city, Ethan wrestled with his own emotional storm. The encounter with Christopher had left him shaken to his core. He had finally uncovered the truth about his past, but it brought no peace, only a profound sense of grief. The father he had once looked up to from a distance, the man whose approval he had secretly craved, had been the very source of his pain. Yet, despite the fiery anger that coursed through him, Ethan couldn't escape the hollow feeling that lingered inside. He had cut Christopher out of his life and rejected every attempt Christopher made to reconcile. But, despite distancing himself, peace eluded him. The pain of abandonment ran too deep, and learning the truth about his origins weighed heavily on him. He had struggled to escape the shadows of his past, only to find those shadows darker now that the truth had come to light. Ethan kept his distance from both Christopher and Catherine, unsure of how to navigate his next steps. His bond with Catherine remained, though it felt fragile. She, too, had been deceived, and Ethan could see the hurt in her eyes, a silent plea for a relationship they never had the chance to build. But he couldn't offer her forgiveness yet. The wounds were too fresh, the betrayal too deep. Meanwhile, Christopher's world continued to fall apart. Once a confident businessman, Christopher now found himself more and more isolated, his power slipping away. Due to the scandal involving his personal life, investors withdrew. Rumors of his cruelty and the family he had abandoned had tarnished his name, which was once associated with success. For the first time, Christopher felt the full weight of his decisions. The fortune he had fought for now felt meaningless without the love and respect of his family. He had destroyed any chance of reconciling with his son. Catherine, the woman who had stood by his side for years, had left him. His empire, built at such a high cost, was crumbling, and all that remained was regret. Catherine, on the other hand, was beginning to rebuild. The divorce had freed her from the web of lies Christopher had spun, and though her future was unclear, she was committed to moving forward. She focused on healing and finding peace after years of grief and betrayal. She knew it would take time to rebuild her relationship with Ethan, but she was willing to wait. Every hesitant phone call, every awkward conversation brought her hope that they might one day close the gap between them. But Ethan wasn't ready to let go of his anger. His resentment toward his parents still simmered beneath the surface. Years of abandonment and betrayal were too fresh in his mind. He buried himself in work, not to prove anything to Christopher, but to prove to himself that he could succeed on his own. He had built his life from the ground up, and he would continue to rise, no matter what. But no matter how much he achieved, the emptiness lingered. The revelations about his past had helped fill in the gaps of his life, but they also left him with more questions than answers. He grappled with his sense of self, wondering if he was a survivor, a victim of his father's ambitions, or simply a man struggling to make sense of a life that had been built on deception. Who would he have been if things had gone differently? As time went on, Ethan's relationship with Catherine remained distant but was slowly changing. They met occasionally for coffee or a quick dinner, their conversations still awkward but tinged with cautious optimism. Catherine never pushed for more than he was ready to give, and while Ethan was grateful for her patience, he was unsure how to navigate this new dynamic. He knew she had suffered too, but the years they had lost weighed heavily on him. One evening, after a particularly rough day at work, Ethan found himself alone in his apartment, the city lights twinkling outside his window. The emptiness inside him felt stifling, and the silence of his small space was almost unbearable. He thought about everything that had happened, the lies, the betrayals, the confrontations, and realized that no matter how hard he tried to bury the past, it still haunted him. He picked up his phone, staring at Catherine's number, his thumb hovering over the screen. It had been weeks since they last spoke, and he didn't know what to say. He didn't even know if he was ready to talk. But some part of him, whether it was a glimmer of hope or just the fatigue from carrying all the pain alone, pushed him to call her. The phone rang once, twice, and then he heard Catherine's soft, hesitant voice. "Ethan." For a moment, he was at a loss for words, his chest tight, everything he had planned to say slipping away. "Can we talk?" he finally whispered. There was a pause on the other end, and then Catherine responded, her voice filled with careful hope. "Of course I'm here, Ethan. Always." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan felt the faint stirrings of something he hadn't let himself feel in years, the possibility of healing. Across the city, Christopher sat alone in his dimly lit office, staring out at the same skyline. His heart was heavy with regret as his empire crumbled around him, taking with it the last remnants of the life he had worked so hard to build. But more than anything, he had lost his son, and maybe his soul. The consequences of his actions were unavoidable now, and deep down, he understood that the damage was permanent. Ethan sat in a small Manhattan cafe, the morning light streaming through the windows, casting a warm glow on the table where his cup of coffee sat untouched. Across from him, Catherine sat in silence, her eyes a mix of warmth and uncertainty. They had been meeting more often since his initial call, but there was still an undeniable awkwardness between them, two people trying to rebuild something that had never truly existed. For Ethan, the past few months had been a roller coaster of emotions, discovering long-hidden truths, grappling with anger, and doing some deep soul-searching. He had finally confronted the truth about his origins and the man who had both shaped and destroyed his life. Now, he was left trying to pick up the pieces. Yet, despite everything, he had no clear path forward. The future seemed uncertain, filled with lingering emotions and questions that had yet to find answers. Catherine took a sip of her tea and offered him a gentle smile. "You look tired, Ethan," she said softly, her voice tinged with motherly concern. "Are you taking care of yourself?" Ethan gave a quick nod, but the weariness in his body told a different story. "I'm trying. It's just a lot." Catherine nodded in understanding. For years, she had imagined what it would be like to sit across from her son, speaking to him, and trying to bridge the gap that Christopher's betrayal had caused. But now that the moment had arrived, it was far more complicated than she had anticipated. Both of them bore the emotional scars of Christopher's decisions, and while they were trying to reconnect, it felt fragile. "I don't want to pressure you," she said gently, placing her hands on the table. "I just want you to know I'm here for whatever you need. I know we've missed out on a lot, but I'm hoping we can start to build something new." Ethan stared down at his coffee, his mind racing. He wanted to believe it was possible to create something from the wreckage of their past, but the bitterness that had settled inside him was hard to shake. His life had been defined by abandonment, a father who had thrown him away, and a mother who, though not at fault, had still been absent for so many years. But when he glanced up at Catherine, seeing the hope and sadness in her eyes, he felt a small shift within himself. Something softened. She'd endured her own share of pain, deceived by Christopher, manipulated, and left searching for 2 long decades for a son she believed had been taken from her. In her own way, she was as much a casualty of his lies as anyone else. "I don't know how to move on from this," Ethan confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything feels shattered, and I'm not sure it can be put back together." Catherine reached across the table, resting her hand softly on his. "We don't need to fix everything all at once," she said calmly. "We just have to take things one step at a time. I'm not asking for miracles, Ethan." Her tone was gentle but firm. "I just want to be a part of your life, however you're comfortable with that." A lump formed in Ethan's throat. He'd spent so long trying to escape his past, running from the pain, that he hadn't stopped to think about what it would mean to actually heal. It wasn't about wiping away the past or pretending it never happened. It was about figuring out how to live alongside it. "I think I'd like that," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd like to try." Catherine's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her smile was warm as she gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. "That's all I've ever wanted." They sat quietly together, the weight of the past still heavy between them. But for the first time, the path ahead seemed just a little less daunting. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Christopher Lindsay sat alone in what used to be the grand office of Lindsay Corporation. Now it was just a hollow remnant of its former glory. The damage from his divorce and the scandal that had engulfed his personal life had left a trail of destruction. Investors had pulled out, clients had distanced themselves, and his once flourishing business was now just a shadow of its peak. But what cut deeper than the financial ruin was the loneliness. Christopher had lost Catherine, the woman who had stood by him through years of both triumph and hardship, and he had lost Ethan, the son he had betrayed and abandoned. The consequences of his choices had come back to haunt him, leaving behind only the emptiness of a life built on deceit and selfishness. He gazed out the window, watching the city as it carried on, the distant sounds of traffic. A constant reminder that the world hadn't stopped, even if his own life had fallen apart. He had tried to reach out to Ethan, hoping for a chance to make things right, but every effort had been met with silence. And now Christopher understood. Ethan's silence was his answer. Ethan would never forgive him, and Christopher couldn't fault him for that. Sitting alone in his office, Christopher faced the harsh reality that the empire he had poured his entire life into meant nothing without the people he loved. The wealth and success he once believed would guarantee his future felt empty in the shadow of his regrets. For years, he had justified his choices, convincing himself that his actions were for the greater good. Christopher, however, realized that he had made a mistake now that his actions were all around him. He had walked away from his son, deceived his wife, and in doing so, destroyed the very things that truly mattered. There would be no redemption for Christopher Lindsay. The damage was done, and as he sat in silence, he had no choice but to face the full weight of the consequences. Outside a bustling cafe, Ethan watched the city move around him, life continuing as it always did. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if he would ever fully heal from the pain of his past. But for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. Forgiving Christopher wasn't on the horizon. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The betrayal had cut too deep and the scars ran too wide. But with Catherine, there was a chance, small, but a chance nonetheless, that they could rebuild something. It wouldn't fix everything, wouldn't bring back the lost time, but it could be a beginning. As Ethan walked through the crowded streets, he reflected on his life. His determination to succeed and the empire he had created were both driven by a desire to redeem himself and move past his past. But now, as he thought about what lay ahead, he realized it wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about living life on his own terms. The past would always be a part of him, the hurt, the betrayal, the abandonment. But Ethan had endured it. He had made it through the worst, and now, as he took cautious steps toward healing, he understood that his future was in his hands. The Lindsay family, broken and scarred from years of deceit, had closed one chapter. But as Ethan looked up at the towering skyscrapers, he knew a new chapter was beginning, one filled with uncertainty. Yes, but also with the possibility of something better, and for now, that was enough.